When the fire alarm shrieked through the empty high-rise and emergency lights plunged the corridor into darkness, the woman on the marble floor knew it was over. Every boardroom victory, every private jet, every headline with her name on it, all of it was meaningless. She couldn't stand up. She couldn't breathe, and she couldn't call for help. As smoke curled under the executive office doors, panic turning her thoughts to static. A janitor pushing a dented cleaning cart at the far end of the hall dropped everything and ran. For him, emergencies weren't theoretical. They were memories, the kind that came from losing a wife too young, from learning how fast a life can break. He reached her side, lifted her shoulder so she could breathe, and in that single moment, a future they couldn't imagine began to unfold. Just hours earlier, she had stood before her board as the most powerful woman in the city, announcing layoffs, closures, and ruthless cuts after a financial collapse wiped out her empire overnight. She was respected, feared, and completely alone. He had started his shift the same way he always did, kissing his sleeping daughter's forehead, promising her breakfast, and stepping into a world that barely saw him. He worked nights because grief was quieter after midnight. Now, as sirens wailed below and smoke thickened, he carried her down the stairwell, one careful step at a time. He ignored the pain in his back and the fear in his chest, because saving her meant someone else's child. Wouldn't he have to grow up without a parent? When firefighters finally took over, she clutched his sleeve, her hands shaking, and asked his name. But he had already stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the crowd. Heroes who clean floors don't expect applause. The world moved on. Headlines shifted from her downfall to market recovery. Lying in a hospital bed, she replayed the moment she had been helpless, stripped of status and control, saved by a man whose face she couldn't forget. As lawyers argued over what remained of her company, she realized the fire hadn't taken what mattered most. It had revealed how empty her life had become. Wealth had insulated her from humanity, and now the insulation had burned away. She began asking questions that confused her staff, questions about janitors, night shifts, about the man who carried her when everyone else ran for the elevators. Weeks later, she found him mopping floors in a different building, having lost his job to budget cuts. He wasn't a symbol or a savior, just a tired father with kind eyes who apologized for the smell of cleaning chemicals and worried about picking up his daughter on time. In that quiet conversation between mismatched lives, she felt something new. Respect without fear, gratitude without transaction. When she offered money, he refused it. Not with pride, but with dignity. He explained that help given freely shouldn't become a debt. That refusal stayed with her, forcing her to confront a truth she had avoided for decades. Power without compassion is just noise. So she did something that terrified her more than bankruptcy ever had. She asked him for advice. Not about business, but about starting over. About raising a child when the future feels broken. He told her about small wins and long nights. About learning resilience not from books, but from just showing up, day after day. As their conversations grew, a bond form had built, not on rescue, but an understanding. She decided to rebuild her life, not as a titan, but as a contributor, investing what was left into fair wages and second chances. She asked him to help guide it, not as a figurehead, but as a partner whose perspective mattered. She restored his sense of worth at a time when he believed the world only needed him to clean its messes. The transformation was an instant. There were setbacks, skepticism, and nights when both of them doubted their choices. But what endured was the quiet certainty that they had met at the exact moment they each needed to be, reminded of who they were beneath the titles and uniforms. Years later, watching their daughters play together in a park, he understood that changing a life doesn't always require wealth or strategy. Sometimes, it just requires seconds of courage in a hallway filled with smoke. And she understood that losing everything had been the first honest thing to ever happen to her. It had cleared the way for something real, something human, something lasting. Dignity isn't granted by status, and humanity isn't defined by success. Sometimes, the person who cleans the floor is the only one who knows how to lift you up. But they didn't expect how quickly the world would test that fragile new beginning. Forces from her old life pushed back hard. Investors circled again. Former colleagues undermined her decisions. The media questioned why a fallen billionaire was suddenly listening to a janitor. The pressure mounted, and she faltered. One night, she woke up convinced that trusting someone so different was another mistake she couldn't afford. At the same time, he faced his own storm. His daughter came home in tears after classmates mocked his job, asking why her father smelled like cleaning supplies instead of success. Old wounds he thought were buried reopened. When their doubts collided in a conversation that went wrong, sharp words spoken from fear, the distance between their worlds felt vast and final. For days, they didn't speak. Then, a crisis forced clarity. His daughter had a severe asthma attack. He found himself alone in a hospital hallway, staring at medical forms he couldn't afford, reliving the night he lost his wife. He swore he wouldn't lose anyone else, and it was there, under the flickering fluorescent lights, that she appeared. Not with lawyers or assistants, but with her sleeves rolled up and fear in her eyes. She had been trying to reach him all day, and when she heard what happened, she just ran. In that moment, their defenses crumbled. Pride had almost cost them something precious. Dignity didn't mean isolation. Strength, they realized, sometimes meant asking for help before it was too late. They sat together through the night, her holding his daughter's hand, and he realized that trust had quietly taken root despite their fears. The seconds that had once changed everything in a burning hallway were still unfolding. Not as a rescue anymore, but as a commitment, the choice to stand beside someone when walking away would be easier. By morning, when his daughter opened her eyes and smiled weakly at both of them, the world outside hadn't softened, but something far more important had settled between them. They would no longer face their storms alone. Real transformation doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives when two broken paths decide to run forward together. From that night on, everything changed. Not through headlines, but through quiet choices repeated every day. She returned to her company and rebuilt it with honesty, cutting ties with those who valued profit over people, accepting losses she once would have hidden. He continued to mop floors, not because he had to, but because his dignity never depended on a title. Slowly, their lives began to overlap in simple, human ways: hospital visits, early morning coffees, long conversations where money meant nothing and pain wasn't a weakness. Finally, she stood before her company and admitted the truth. About her failure, her fear, and the stranger who reminded her what mattered. Some walked out, but those who stayed became something new, a company rebuilt on purpose. She didn't offer him wealth or rescue, only opportunity. When he hesitated, thinking of his daughter, she said something that stayed with him forever. "The moment you saved me was unabout changing my life. It was about revealing your own worth." Standing there, his daughter holding his hand, he finally understood that being ordinary never meant being invisible. The world doesn't change through billionaires or heroes and headlines. It changes in seconds, when someone chooses compassion over fear, dignity over pride, and humanity over convenience. Years later, when his daughter would ask how everything turned around, he wouldn't talk about money or miracles. He would tell her about a moment when a broken woman and a tired janitor crossed paths, and how in saving each other, they proved that even after everything is lost, it only takes one brave, selfless act to begin again.